Coming up next on the SPNN Forum, we have Maria de la Cruz, Executive Director of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Hi, I'm Martin Ludden, Executive Director of the St. Paul Neighborhood Network. Today on the SPNN Forum, we welcome Maria de la Cruz, Executive Director of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Maria, welcome to the forum.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So can you tell us a little bit about the Headwaters Foundation for Justice and kind of what the mission and the history is there?
Absolutely. So the Headwaters Foundation for Justice was founded in 1984. It was started by a group of friends who come from some of Minnesota's most prominent families. And at that point, they were really coming together to think about how to do philanthropy differently. So they raised money from their friends and their networks, and very quickly made a decision to fund social justice work. What they really cared about was empowering the community to make change. So over 35 years later, I'm really honored to be able to serve in this role. And our current mission statement is to amplify the power of community to advance equity and justice. And so we're really excited that this is the legacy that we've inherited.
Nice. So 1984, at that point, what issues in philanthropy were that kind of founding group of donors, what issues were they trying to solve?
Yeah. So keep in mind that those founding members of Headwaters really grew up throughout the 60s and 70s. So they were, around for the civil rights movement. They were dealing with the aftermath of the Vietnam War, of course, the women's rights movement. And so they were funding things like, domestic violence organizations, ensuring that people had access to housing and healthcare, a lot of the same issues that, nearly 40 years later, we're still dealing with.
Yeah, I think there's a conversation now, and I have to say I'm new-ish to the nonprofit sector, so this may not be as new a conversation as I think it is, but about, kind of systemic issues in philanthropy, and this seems like A, incredibly forward-looking to have been doing it this way for so many years already, but B, a model for how philanthropy could be done differently.
Yeah, so Headwaters does what we call our community-led grant-making process. And that's something that has been developed over a couple of decades. But it did start with those original donors who really were thinking about the kind of power and privilege that they have. And so early on, they were working with community members to help determine where their dollars would go. One of our longtime former staff, Monica Bryant, she's now at Voices for Racial Justice. She is really one of the people that helped to create this model in which we're bringing in community leadership to be able to do our grant making with us. From reading applications, going on site visits, making those final funding recommendations to our board of directors. And that's really unique. Most foundations, especially most community foundations, but other foundations work in much the same way, where they are, the program staff are doing that legwork, but really the people who are making those decisions are the board of trustees. And so that's a really different model than what we have. It's really, for us, grounded in that trust and community.
Yeah. In order to make that work, you have to already be so tied into the community. So how do you do that work at the same time as the grant making work, or is that just kind of baked into everything?
Yeah, so Headwaters is really one of these organizations where we talk about community ownership. We're a community foundation, so we raise every dollar we grant out. And we've been really intentional, both in the ways that we do our hiring. Our staff really come from community organizing and activism work. And oftentimes what we're seeing is that our grantees are also participating in our grant making process with us. Their executive directors and other leaders might be sending their staff in so that folks can really start to understand what a different way of philanthropy can look like.
Yeah. I think a recent example was you launched the Transformation Fund in response to the murder of George Floyd and launched it so quickly. So can you talk us through kind of what did that process look like? Because I think it was a 1 week turnaround basically. And what is the aim of that fund?
Yeah. So to talk about the Transformation Fund, we actually have to go further back and talk about the coronavirus. We made the decision pretty early on in mid-March to raise dollars for our grantee organizations, which are largely led by Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color who are doing organizing and advocacy every day and are doing it in a way that is lifting up the leadership of community members. And so what our grantees were hearing at that time was all of the ways that their communities were being disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, not only in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of social impact, economic impact, and political impact. And so we initially went through and said, great, we're going to raise some money for this. We were able to raise $1.1 million for our COVID-19 response work. And we made over $757,000 in grants at that time. We had no idea that we were going to have another crisis compound the already difficult impact of what the coronavirus had in our communities. So when the murder of George Floyd occurred, we instantly went into kind of a strategy mode. And what we knew already from fundraising around COVID-19 is that our donors, the Headwaters community, really understands the root causes of why Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by the healthcare system and by law enforcement. So we were able to work with two donors in particular who put up seed money to put together the Transformation Fund. And they pledged $2 million. Wow. And we are now growing that pot of money. And so we've had individual donors, other institutional partners come in and say, you know what, Headwaters has been at the forefront of thinking through this kind of change and this kind of crisis for a long time. So we're really proud that we are entrusted with those dollars. And by the end of this month, our goal is to grant out about $1.2 million from that original $2 million. Wow. That is going to groups that are really on the ground and have been on the ground since day one and continue to be on the ground. And so what we're seeing is, of course, I'm sure you're hearing about it as well, all of the ways that mutual aid is continuing in communities. Mutual aid was already taking place because of the coronavirus and now continues, particularly in South Minneapolis, where folks are experiencing so many different dynamics of impact from the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah. So what groups are you, focusing on, and what kind of grants are you making, and what kind of projects are you funding with the Transformation Fund?
Yeah. So a couple of examples. For us, the thing that we care about the most is ensuring that Black and Indigenous and other people of color are really supported to rebuild, but not just to rebuild to what things have been like in the last number of decades, right? But actually to build based off of community desire and community dreams. And so that requires community organizers like the leaders at Black Visions Collective. We've been a longtime funder of theirs, and Candace Montgomery is a fantastic leader who has really been taking this moment and this momentum as an opportunity to really lift up the voices of other Black leaders. So that's one group that we've been supporting. And then we have another organization, McGizzy, which is right on Lake Street. Their building was burned down. Kelly Drummer, their executive director, is a fantastic leader in the community. We made a grant to them to help them rebuild and to really get their feet back under them. It's going to be a long journey for them to figure out what that looks like. Yeah. And then we also made a grant to the West Broadway Coalition, thinking about what does it look like to rebuild business districts, particularly those that are really Black-led. You have so many small businesses that were so deeply impacted, and we see the business environment as being part of the environment that we want to have for all of our communities, but in particular those small businesses.
Yeah, those business communities are so such a heartbeat, especially on Broadway there, and on Lake Street and South Minneapolis. You mentioned McGeezy. They've long been a partner of SPNN as well, and I think we were hoping to have Kelly on a forum sometime in the near future. So thank you for that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Where, geographically right now, it seems the current need is, pretty localized right here in the heart of the Twin Cities, Lake Street, Broadway, South Side, North Side. Is your focus usually in the metro, or do you work out in greater Minnesota as well?
Yeah, so Headwaters is a statewide foundation. So we are, I would say, probably the majority, probably about 60 to 70% of our dollars are concentrated within the Twin Cities metro area. But we have really been focusing over the last 6 years on figuring out ways for us to build deeper relationships in rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota. We have a particular focus on supporting Indigenous-led organizations through our Fund of the Sacred Circle, which takes us into more rural and tribal areas. And those relationships really matter. I mean, we all talk about, right, the fact that we are standing and working and living on stolen land. And so for us, that commitment to ensure that we are providing resources and support to Indigenous organizations that are outside the Twin Cities is really important to us.
Yeah. I think, to go back to kind of the first part of the conversation about social justice, how does, as a foundation geared towards funding social justice, do you get that, do you find kind of your causes from your community engagement, or is there board direction there, or how do you look and find where to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, it goes back to the many decades that we've been working in community. We are very clear as a foundation across our board and our staff that what we are working towards is Black liberation and Native sovereignty. And we center those experiences not to the exclusion of other communities, but actually to the benefit for all of our communities. We know that this country and actually this state is founded on a very violent history for both Black and Indigenous people. And so that has been a part of our underpinnings for so many years. And so when we have been working in community, part of it is, frankly, word of mouth. I mean, we have a staff member a long time ago who used to say we were the best kept secret in Minnesota. And I think that was really true. Organizers and activists who knew who we were, but really the broader public didn't. And so I think it really comes from those roots of knowing that we were one of the first foundations to fund the domestic violence movement, to fund in Latino communities, things like that. And so the fact that how we do our staffing, our hiring processes, things like that, it's about being connected to the community. And so we, both at the board level and the staff level, our folks are really well connected to their neighborhoods. They're doing other organizing and activism work as part of their, just part of their daily lives as well. So we have those established relationships.
Yeah, that best kept secret thing is kind of it's a blessing and a curse sometimes. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. And part of the last number of years has really been to figure out how do we get out there more broadly? How are we talking to our constituents? And part of that is really kind of looking at it from twofold. One is, our donor network has expanded so much. And I think that the Transformation Fund and the fundraising we did around COVID-19 is really a demonstration of what that looks like. It means that we can call on our donor community who really understands our values and make a bold and powerful invitation to them to give. It also means that we can contact our grantee community and they can tell us the real story of what's going on. We're often hearing from our grantee partners about how they feel like they have to bend themselves into pretzels to fit the criteria or the whim of a foundation or funder in that moment. And we're not interested in that. We want to know the real story. And I think that trust has been built and goes a long way for us to be able to know that we can be on the streets, or we can make a phone call or send a text message, and that our partners are really going to trust us with the information that they need to provide us to be as supportive as we can.
Mm-hmm. If you're just joining us on the forum, we are in conversation with Maria de la Cruz, the Executive Director of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Going back to that kind of like that best kept secret part, there's something so Minnesotan about it in kind of that like aw shucks Minnesota way that we don't like to brag on ourselves sometimes. But I think, how do you find that? I think it's really easy to look at the community engagement you need to do to broaden that impact and see that as a nice to have, when the have to have is, the program work and the fundraising and the grant making. So how do you balance that staffing wise? Do you have a dedicated team for kind of the outreach side of it that's different from the program team, or are they doing that together?
Yeah. So everybody on our team are relationship managers, whether they're program officers, fundraisers, our communications staff. Everybody is here to be connectors and ambassadors for Headwaters. So when I think about what does that look like outside of the program team, Vanessa Fuentes, our Director of Network and Narrative, is a fantastic resource for us in the arts community. She's a writer and has a really broad network. And so, she has been keeping her finger on the pulse of all of the art that's been happening, especially in this last month, that's really raising up the voices of communities of color, really highlighting and focusing on what does it look like? Why are people painting murals on walls right now? How is that impacting the narrative of our community? And so that's just one example of sort of that out of the box way that we are making sure that, we're staying connected.
That's when I saw Vanessa's job title, I think in looking at your website or in emailing, when I saw Director of Narrative, I assumed that was Headwaters' narrative, so that she was in a communications role. But is she actually focused on what narrative, what stories are being told about the communities that you serve?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Vanessa is both thinking about how is she uplifting and broadcasting Headwaters' mission into the world, which frankly, absent of our grantee partners and our donors, is meaningless. I mean, we can't just talk about Headwaters' mission and the grants going out the door if we're not talking about the people who actually are the lifeblood of our foundation.
About 10 minutes left.
And so, for example, we will be, early on in July, we'll be launching a new storytelling project that is her brainchild, called Tributaries, really kind of working off that theme of water and the headwaters for us. And it's really going to be about telling the stories of the people and organizations and even the future we're aspiring to, and really telling the story of not just the Twin Cities, but the state of Minnesota. We're often considered flyover country, but not right now, clearly. Yeah. Everybody has their eyes on us. Yeah. And so we want to make sure that from our lens as a social justice foundation, we're taking this opportunity to really highlight those stories. And so Tributaries will be coming out soon, and we're just so excited to be able to amplify all the voices of these amazing leaders.
You talk about the future that you envision and working towards Native sovereignty and Black liberation. As a funding organization, where are you putting funds to advance those goals, and what does that future look like?
So Headwaters is working towards Black liberation and Native sovereignty by funding specifically systems change work. Okay. We talk with our grantees about what are the root causes of the problems in your community. And they're really saying, listen, it's about the structural violence. It's about the ways that our systems are actually operating as they were designed. So for example, even as we're looking at the current and frankly, long-standing environment with law enforcement. What we know is that law enforcement's roots are actually in slave catching. Yeah. right? So when we look all the way back through history, what Harriet Tubman was working against was slave catchers who were trying to capture and return Black enslaved people to owners. And when we think about what that looks like for us in modern day context, that looks like the criminalization of Black people. It looks like the war on drugs. It looks like the war on poverty. It looks like all of these system structures and policies that have been created to ensure that Black and brown people are not free. And we're super clear about that at Headwaters. We are unapologetic about that analysis because we continue to see year after year, generation after generation, that is what is happening with our communities. So that's, for us, that's the part that we're focusing on when we talk with potential grantees about the kind of work they want to do and to get funding from Headwaters.
So you're talking about systems change work, and I think, the biggest shift in narrative I've seen kind of since George Floyd's murder, and this is, in me personally, in the broader community, kind of in mainstream media, is this idea that like, it's not a bug, it's a feature. This is like the system is doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and there are ways that we need to change that system, especially with regard to law enforcement. And I'm one of those folks that, in that 2 weeks after his murder, I was like, okay, yeah, I get it. I understand defunding or abolishing, however you want to talk about it. But you all have been there for a long time. So how has it been to see that shift now? And kind of how do you ride that towards, how do you keep that going to actually affect, change in the moment now?
Yeah. I think first it starts with the people. Headwaters is very intentionally a multiracial and cross-class organization across our board and our staff, across even our volunteers and other constituents. Listen, part of this is we have no choice. For the Black and brown people that are a part of Headwaters, racism is something that we face every single day. And so we don't get to walk away from the subject. It's part of my dinner time. It's part of raising my children. And that experience, for better or for worse, I don't get to separate out my professional life from my personal life.
5 minutes.
And so for me and for my team in particular, we have been at this for a really long time. And just in my time, I've been at Headwaters for 6 years. There have been 3 very public murders of Black men in our community: Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, and now George Floyd. And those are just 3 of many, many people who have been abused and killed at the hands of law enforcement. We don't know the names of other people in our community who have suffered that fate, right? So that's something that we grapple with a great deal. When Jamar Clark was killed, that was the first time that we launched an emergency fund, a rapid response fund, and we launched the emergency fund for Black lives. And we were very intentional about saying it's the emergency fund for Black lives. It doesn't mean that other brown and other people of color do not experience that same fate. But when we look at 1 in 3 Black men are going to be incarcerated in their lifetimes, that's a stark reality when you think about other communities. The other community in our state that suffers as well are Indigenous folks who are also highly incarcerated. And so this is something that's been a part of our consciousness as an organization for a really long time. I think that, right now, when people are hearing and seeing the impact of the coronavirus, that Black people are 3 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white people, that is a huge statistic. When we're seeing an entire community of people get turned away at hospitals from testing, things like that, that's really stark. And so I think it's the combined narrative, it's the combined reality of COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others who have recently been killed that really starts to show us the ways in which our systems and institutions exacerbate this violence as an overall culture. right? This is actually part of our culture. It's not just these institutions, but when we're now seeing white people start to realize and come to this awakening of this is real, this is really happening. For the rest of us who've been in this for so long, we're like, thank you, like welcome. We're excited you're here, and we need you to do your education to get really clear about this isn't just about 2020. This is something that communities have been facing for hundreds of years. And so when we're thinking about like, how do we stay in it? How do we continue to move forward? What we know, we have a good friend, Beth Zemsky, who's been a great teacher over the years, organizer and activist in her own right. And she talks about the fact that systems change, that this kind of racial justice, those changes are incremental, unfortunately. They happen over a generation or two. So we're not going to see the change in a couple of years, right? So for us, we think about it as, what is Headwaters' role to stay with this for the long term? Yeah. And that's why we're here. You know, it's easy to get discouraged, but I feel a lot of hope along with that despair.
2 minutes.
So one last thing before we wrap, as you kind of end on that note of hope, talk about, do you have, you know, is there a win that Headwaters likes to talk about? Do you have, like, what's your favorite recent story about a funding project that's gone really well?
So one of our favorite projects to talk about is with an organization called Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, United Renters for Justice. They were founded, and we were their first grantee in 2015, or we were the first funder, in 2015. They started out, when we first met with them, we were meeting in one of their members' apartments. And your viewers might know about the campaign against Steve Friends, who's a slumlord in our city here. And Inquilinos really came up out of the crisis because Steve Friends was not taking care of property, was improperly evicting people, was doing all kinds of predatory acts against his renters, who are primarily renters of color. Many of them are Latino folks. And so, you know, fast forward now 5 years later, and Inquilinos has now purchased the Corcoran neighborhood apartments. Their members are going to be creating a co-op. They're going to be thinking through, what does affordable housing look like when it's community-centered and community-driven, not driven by developers, not driven by landlords. And we're so proud of that. That is a group of Black and Brown residents who have really stuck with it. They have endured so much. And we're just incredibly proud to have been just a tiny fraction of that work.
And how, like, so much of this comes back to housing, which is like a whole nother interview's worth of information. Maria, thank you so much for joining us and for having a great conversation. This has been the SPNN Forum, and we've been here with Maria de la Cruz, Executive Director of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.